All this knitting is such a useless hobby for someone your age, Eleanor. Lisa's voice cut through my kitchen like sharp needles. Sitting hunched over yarn all day can't be good for your posture. I sat at my kitchen table working on a baby blanket, the same table where I'd knitted sweaters for 3 children and counted grandchildren. My old wooden jewelry box sat nearby, holding my collection of vintage knitting needles. Lisa picked up my current project dismissively, the soft blue yarn slipping through her fingers, like water she couldn't hold or control. "What is this even supposed to become?" she asked, her voice carrying that tone she used when discussing my outdated habit. "Another blanket no one really needs?" Another blanket, as if the dozens I'd made over 48 years meant nothing, as if handmade gifts were burdens rather than expressions of love, crafted stitch by careful stitch. "I'm making this for the new baby," I said quietly, continuing my steady rhythm of knit one, purl one, the meditation that had sustained me through decades of joy and sorrow. "Babies don't need handmade blanket," Lisa replied sharply. "Store-bought is cleaner, safer, more practical. All this homemade stuff is just sentimental nonsense." My son William sat at the breakfast nook, reading his newspaper, saying nothing to defend his mother, the same mother who'd knitted his first sweater, his school mitten, his graduation scarf. Lisa continued her assessment of my life's passion. "The yarn costs more than buying something ready-made, and all those hours spent could be used for more productive activities. As if creating beauty from simple strands of wool wasn't production of the highest order, as if love made visible through patient handwork had no value in her modern world." William finally looked up, but not in my defense. "Maybe Mom could try a different hobby, something less time-consuming, as if the time spent creating gifts for family was somehow wasted rather than invested in relationships that would outlast us all." Silence isn't surrender, it's strength gathering its breath. I'm Eleanor. I'm 74 years old. I live in Millbrook, Maine. I've been knitting for 48 years, without missing a single day. I raised 3 children and buried a husband. I documented every milestone in mittens, sweaters, and baby blanket. Today, my daughter-in-law called my life's passion a useless hobby for someone my age, while I worked on a blanket for her own coming grandchild in the kitchen where every stitch had been created with love. But what Lisa doesn't know is this: my wooden jewelry box holds more than vintage knitting needle. It holds secrets woven into yarn that will change everything about her assumption. If you've ever felt overlooked in your own home, you'll understand why this moment stayed with me. This kitchen on Birch Street has witnessed 43 years of family knitting. Every Christmas sweater, every birthday scarf, every baby blanket welcoming new life into our growing family circle. I learned to knit when William was born, a new mother wanting to create something special for my firstborn, something that couldn't be bought in any store or catalog. The morning light still streamed through my kitchen window, the same light that illuminated my first clumsy stitches as I learned to transform yarn into expressions of maternal love. My wooden jewelry box holds treasures beyond normal jewelry, vintage knitting needles passed down from my grandmother, stitch markers my mother gave me, pattern cards written in her careful script. Each needle tells a story of projects completed and gifts given, of late nights finishing Christmas presents, of quiet afternoons creating baby clothes for children not yet born. Some truths arrive quietly but change everything. After Charles died 4 years ago, my knitting became even more important, a way to feel connected to family scattered across the country, a method for sending love through packages containing warmth. Lisa sees only an old woman wasting time on outdated craft. She doesn't understand that every stitch is a prayer, every row a meditation on continuity and connection across generations. She wants me to modernize my interests, take up activities she considers more appropriate for someone my age and circumstances. Book clubs, senior center program, supervised social activities. William inherited his father's gentle nature, but not Charles's appreciation for handmade beauty. He sees potential waste where his father saw legacy and love. Lisa means well in her efficient way. She sees inefficiencies that need correcting, time that could be better spent on activities she understands and can easily categorize. My knitting isn't just a hobby, it's my signature in the world. the proof that my hands can still create something beautiful, that my love can take tangible form. The criticisms started gently, like dropped stitches, that seem fixable until they spread. Lisa would comment on my obsessive knitting during her visits to check on my general well-being. All this repetitive motion can't be healthy for your joints. Maybe you should limit your crafting to certain hours. Give your hands a rest. She'd point out storage issues. These baskets of yarn take up so much space. Maybe it's time to use up what you have instead of buying more supplies constantly. My yarn collection, organized by color and weight, each skein chosen for specific projects, waiting patiently for the right pattern, the perfect recipient. Digital crafts might be better, she'd suggest. You could design patterns on a computer or tablet, less physical strain, more modern approach. Digital patterns, without the feel of wool between my fingers, without the rhythm that calmed my mind and soothed my worried heart. Dignity whispers what anger cannot. The real pressure began when she started pointing out my declining abilities. These stitches aren't as even as they used to be. Maybe your eyesight is making this too difficult. My stitches were perfectly even. My eyesight remained sharp, but Lisa's observations planted seeds of doubt in William's mind about my continuing competence. Mom seems to be struggling with her knitting lately, he mentioned after one of her visits. Maybe she should consider easier hobbies that don't require such precise coordination. Easier hobbies, as if 48 years of accumulated skill should be abandoned at the first sign of imaginary decline. William began nodding along with Lisa's suggestions, not from conviction, but from exhaustion with topics that created family tension. Every time we gathered, a home remembers the hands that built it. Lisa started questioning my project choices. Do you really need to make another blanket? How many does one family actually need for practical use? My blankets weren't just practical. They were heirlooms in the making, comfort objects that would outlast me, tangible proof of love that could be touched and held. She suggested I donate my yarn. There are charity groups that could use these supplies for people who actually need warm clothing and blanket, actually need, as if my family's need for handmade expressions of love was less valid than anonymous charity recipient who'd never know the knitter's name. I began to understand then, this wasn't about my health or the practicality of knitting. This was about Lisa's discomfort with activities she couldn't quantify or control through modern efficiency. Autumn brought shorter days and longer knitting hours. Lisa's visits became more focused on convincing me to abandon what she called my time-wasting obsession. She'd arrive with activity brochures. The senior center has wonderful programs, book discussions, card games, exercise classes, much better than sitting alone with yarn all day. Sitting alone, as if knitting was isolation, rather than connection to every person who'd ever worn my creation or slept under my blanket. These repetitive crafts can lead to arthritis, she'd continue. Wouldn't you rather preserve your hand mobility for more important activities? More important activity. Like what? She never specified what could be more important than creating gifts that would comfort family members. Long after I was gone, Lisa began measuring my yarn basket like someone planning reorganization. All this storage space could be used for more practical items, things you actually need for daily living. Daily living, as if creating beauty wasn't part of living fully, as if productivity could only be measured in terms she understood. Some objects hold memories, not value. I started paying closer attention to Lisa's real agenda. Behind this anti-knitting camp, she seemed less interested in my well-being than in controlling how I spent my time and resources. My wooden jewelry box contained more than vintage knitting needles. It held family information Lisa had never bothered exploring: financial documents, property records, important letters that might surprise someone who assumed she knew everything about my situation, including Charles's detailed instruction about my right to continue the activities that brought me joy and purpose in my final years. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. Lisa thought I was a lonely widow, wasting time on outdated hobbies that served no useful purpose. In her vision of productive aging, she had no idea what my knitting actually represented beyond simple craft. No understanding of the careful documentation I'd kept in patterns and projects about our family's growth and changes. Some patterns hold more than instruction. Some projects document more than skills. Some needles have witnessed secrets that only experienced hands could recognize and interpret. The confrontation came on a gray November afternoon. Lisa arrived with William and a stack of senior community brochures featuring craft rooms and supervised activities. "Mom, we need to discuss your living situation," William said, his voice gentle but determined. "This house is getting too big for you to manage alone. Too big to manage. The same house where I'd raised 3 children successfully, suddenly beyond my capability, according to their assessment. These places have wonderful craft programs," Lisa added, "professional instructors, scheduled activities. You wouldn't have to worry about having enough projects to keep you busy. Scheduled activities instead of my own rhythm, professional instructors instead of 48 years of accumulated expertise, projects chosen by others rather than gifts inspired by love." "What about my yarn collection?" I asked. "My needles, my pattern, my unfinished projects?" "You could take some favorites," Lisa said dismissively. "The important thing, everything else could be donated to people who'd actually use them." Some favorites, 48 years of carefully collected supplies, reduced to a few selected items. That fit someone else's idea of appropriate space allocation. "We're really concerned about your isolation," William continued. "Sitting here knitting all day isn't healthy social interaction. You need more stimulation." Stories like this remind us that clarity heals more than confrontation. Social interaction, as if my daily connection, through handwork to family members across the country, wasn't social. As if love transmitted through stitches didn't count as communication. "I've never been isolated," I protested. "My knitting connects me to everyone I love. Every stitch is a conversation with someone I care about." "But that's not real socialization," Lisa replied. "You need face-to-face contact with people your own age, shared activities and common interests. Real socialization, as if the relationships I'd built through decades of creating gifts for family were somehow less authentic than supervised senior center programs." I looked at my son's face, searching for the boy who'd treasured every sweater I'd knitted for school, who'd understood that handmade meant made with hands, that loved him. That night I sat with my current project, a baby blanket for Lisa's own expected grandchild, stitches that would provide comfort long after I was gone. Tomorrow I would show them what they'd missed in their hurry to modernize my final years, what my knitting really contained, beyond simple yarn and pattern. The next morning brought Lisa's arrival, with boxes and labels for organizing your craft supplies so we can decide what's worth keeping and what should be donated. Worth keeping, according to someone who'd never understood the difference between craft supplies and family archive, between hobby materials and heirloom tools. "We should start with the oldest yarn," she continued. "Some of these skeins look moth-eaten or faded, probably not safe for baby projects." Safe for baby projects. My yarn was stored carefully in cedar-lined containers, protected from moths and moisture. Some skeins were vintage, but perfectly preserved and infinitely more valuable than anything sold in modern stores. That's when I decided the time had come. Calm truth cuts deeper than loud accusation. "Lisa, before we pack anything," I said, "I need to show you something in my jewelry box. That might change your perspective." I opened the wooden box slowly, revealing not just vintage needles, but documents carefully preserved. Beneath the crafting tools, papers that told a different story about my knitting and its purpose. "These aren't just patterns," I said, pulling out handwritten cards. "They're family records. Every project documented with dates, recipient, occasion, important events." Lisa frowned as I showed her pattern cards that were actual family chronicle, recording births, graduations, weddings. Through the lens of gifts created, some distances heal more than apology, but the real surprise lay deeper, in a sealed envelope marked in Charles's careful handwriting, "For Eleanor's knitting legacy." Inside were certificates from yarn companies and pattern designers, acknowledging my expertise as a master knitter, whose work had been featured in national magazines. "Your mother-in-law isn't just a hobbyist," I read from one letter. "She's a recognized expert, whose techniques have influenced a generation of knitters." Lisa stared at awards she'd never known existed, understanding dawning about her assumption about my skill level and professional recognition. But there was more. Financial documents showing income from pattern sales and teaching fees that I'd earned over decades. of sharing my expertise. Useless hobby, I continued quietly. That's helped support this family through lean years. That's provided college funds for all my grandchildren. The box contained more surprises, letters from family members, thanking me for specific gifts, describing how my knitted item had provided comfort during illness, warmth during hard times, connection during separation. This blanket got me through chemotherapy, read one letter from my daughter. Every stitch felt like Mom's arm, holding me when I was scared. William arrived as I was reading, more testimonials to the value of what Lisa had called worthless time-wasting activity. This is all documented? He asked quietly. Every project, every recipient, every impact, I replied. 48 years of building family connection through yarn and needles and patient dedication to craft. The silence stretched between us as they processed the implications of dismissing something so significant to our family's history and bond. This wasn't about punishment or humiliation. This was about recognition of value that couldn't be measured in modern efficiency terms, about respect for knowledge earned through decades of loving practice. The silence that followed felt different from previous family discussions, this time weighted with respect rather than dismissal, with understanding rather than assumptions about outdated activities. Lisa spoke first, her voice small. Eleanor, I had no idea about any of this recognition or the income your knitting generated. I never needed to boast, I replied gently. The work spoke for itself, to people who understood its value and importance. William looked at the certificates and letters, understanding finally dawning about his mother's expertise and the family legacy he'd nearly helped destroy. Dad knew about all this, he said quietly. He was proud of your skills, your recognition in the knitting community. Your father understood something crucial, I said. That mastery takes decades to develop. That expertise deserves respect, not dismissal because of age. We spent the next hour talking honestly about assumptions and expertise, about the difference between hobby and professional level skill, developed over a lifetime. Lisa apologized for dismissing my knitting as useless time wasting, for assuming it was just random elderly busy work, without purpose or skill. I can see now how important it is, she said, not just the craft itself, but the connections it creates, the family history it preserves. Some objects hold memories, not value. We talked about going forward differently, about respecting expertise, regardless of its form, about understanding that value can't always be measured in conventional terms. I want to learn, Lisa said. Would you teach me some basic techniques? Help me understand what makes good knitting different from simple craft projects? And I want to help preserve this, William added. Document your techniques, create a record of pattern and family stories for future generations. The wooden jewelry box stayed on my table, no longer hidden but displayed as family archive, worth preserving and consulting when questions arose about our history and connection. Over the following months, our relationships grew stronger, like well-knitted fabric. Lisa started visiting to learn, rather than to criticize, about color choices and stitch patterns. William brought his children regularly to learn about patience and skill. In the kitchen, where their grandfather had watched me create gifts for every family milestone. Grandma's knitting is like magic, my granddaughter said. She takes plain yarn and makes it into beautiful things. It's like she has superpowers. Christmas that year felt like celebration, rather than obligation. Lisa brought me luxury yarn from the specialty shop downtown. The owner said you'd appreciate the quality and fiber content. William's gift was a display case for showing your awards and keeping your vintage needles safe for future generations. If this story touched something familiar, may your next chapter be softer than the last. I learned important lessons about expertise and family dynamic, about the value of mastery developed through decades of practice, about respect for skills that don't fit modern categories. Your talents matter, no matter your age. Your expertise has value. Your right to continue activities that bring mastery and purpose should be protected and honored. Real love supports different definitions of productive aging. Real care recognizes excellence in all its forms. Real protection preserves legacy rather than eliminating them for convenience. Age brings mastery, not obsolescence. Gray hair represents accumulated skill, not diminished capacity. And sometimes, the most valuable gifts are those created by hands that have learned through decades of loving practice. The wooden jewelry box still sits on my kitchen table, no longer hiding secrets, but displaying treasures that prove love takes many forms, including yarn transformed into warmth that lasts long after the knitter has laid down her needles.